So, we're talking today about job interviews in American companies.
And specifically, how those interviews actually function as conversations, not as something separate from everyday professional communication.
Because interviews are conversations. They're structured conversations, certainly, but they're still conversations between people.
That's the part people often underestimate. Interviews feel different, but the same conversational instincts are still at work.
Which is why the opening matters so much. How an interview starts usually sets the tone for everything that follows. There's almost always a brief settling in moment. Whether it's walking into a room or joining a video call, there's a transition before the interview really begins. And during that transition, there's often a small amount of light acknowledgement. Not casual small talk, but not questions yet either. It acts as a buffer, a way for both people to adjust before the conversation becomes more focused.
And I think that's worth noticing because it tells you something about how American professional conversations often work. There's usually this gentle entry point rather than an abrupt start. Although the transition from that opening moment into the interview itself is usually pretty clear. Someone will say something like, "Well, thanks for taking the time to meet with us today," or "I'm glad we could connect." And that signals that the interview is really beginning now.
Right. The tone shifts slightly, but not dramatically. It becomes more focused. There's still warmth in most cases, but the conversation becomes more purposeful.
Hmm. The interviewer might give a brief overview of how the conversation will go. Something like, "I thought we could start by having you tell me a bit about your background, and then I'll ask some questions about your experience. And we'll leave time at the end for any questions you might have."
That kind of framing is common in American interviews. It's a way of giving structure to the conversation so both people understand what's coming.
And it's collaborative in a sense. The interviewer is being transparent about the format, which makes the conversation feel less mysterious. So, once that framing is done, the interview really begins. And I think one thing that stands out in American interview conversations is the pacing. The pacing is careful, it's not rushed. Even when there's a set amount of time for the interview, there's space between questions and answers.
Right. The interviewer asks a question, and then there's this expectation that you'll take a moment to think before responding. That pause isn't awkward, it's normal.
And I think that's something that can feel uncomfortable if you're not used to it, because in some conversational contexts, pausing too long might seem like you don't know what to say. But in an interview, taking a breath before you answer is actually seen as thoughtful.
It is. It shows that you're considering the question seriously rather than just reacting immediately.
And then, when you do answer, the rhythm is usually pretty measured. You're speaking clearly, not rushing through your response, because the interviewer is listening carefully and often taking notes.
That note taking is part of the rhythm, too. You might notice the interviewer looking down while you're speaking, and that's not a sign that they're not interested. They're just capturing what you're saying.
And sometimes they'll nod or make small affirming sounds while you're talking. Little things like, "mm-hmm," or "I see," which are ways of showing they're following along without interrupting you. Those acknowledgments are part of how American professional conversations flow. They keep the dialogue moving without one person dominating or the other person feeling unheard.
Right. And when you finish answering a question, there's usually a moment where the interviewer might ask a follow up question, or they might move on to the next topic. That transition is usually signaled pretty clearly. They might say something like, "That's helpful, thank you," or "I appreciate you sharing that." And then they'll introduce the next question.
Those transitional phrases are really common in American interviews. They're a way of closing one part of the conversation and opening another without making it feel disjointed.
And I think that speaks to something broader about how experience gets discussed in these conversations. It's not just about stating facts, it's about walking someone through your professional story in a way that makes sense to them.
Right. When someone asks about your experience, they're usually looking for a narrative, not just a list of jobs or responsibilities.
They want to understand what you did, but also how you thought about it and what the outcome was.
And the way people talk about their experience in interviews tends to be pretty descriptive. You're painting a picture of a situation or a project, and you're explaining your role in it.
There's a lot of context setting in these conversations. You might say something like, in that position, I was working with a team of 5 people, and we were focused on improving the customer onboarding process. Then you'd move into describing what you actually did, and this is where the conversation becomes pretty specific. You're talking about actions you took, decisions you made, problems you solved.
And the level of detail matters. You're not being vague, but you're also not overwhelming them with every single thing you did. You're choosing the details that help illustrate your experience clearly. And then there's usually some mention of the result or the outcome. What happened because of the work you did? How things changed or improved?
That's a pattern you hear a lot in American interviews. Situation, action, result, but it doesn't feel formulaic when it's happening naturally in conversation. It just feels like someone telling you about their work in a coherent way.
Those questions are part of how the interview conversation stays dynamic. It's not just you delivering a monologue. The interviewer is actively engaged, asking for more detail, or asking how you handled a particular challenge.
And that back and forth is really central to how these conversations work. The interviewer is guiding the conversation, but you're contributing substantively to where it goes based on what you choose to emphasize.
Right. And the questions themselves are interesting because they're doing a few different things at once. They're gathering information, obviously, but they're also giving you an opportunity to demonstrate how you think and communicate. Some questions are pretty straightforward, like, can you tell me about a time when you had to manage a difficult project? That's a direct invitation to share a specific example.
And the way those questions are phrased usually signals what kind of response is expected. When someone says, "Can you tell me about a time?" they're asking for a story, essentially, a concrete example from your experience. Other questions might be more open ended. What interests you about this role? Or how do you approach problem solving? Those questions give you more room to shape your answer, but they also require you to decide what's most relevant to talk about.
And that's where the conversational skill comes in. You're reading the question, understanding what it's really asking, and choosing how to respond in a way that's both honest and relevant to the position. So, for instance, if someone asks, how do you approach problem solving? They're not really looking for a general philosophy lecture. What they're actually asking is how you work through challenges in a professional context. So, you might think about a specific problem you solved recently and walk them through how you approached it, what information you gathered, who you consulted, what options you considered. That gives them a concrete sense of your process rather than an abstract description.
Right. You're translating an open question into something specific and grounded in your actual experience.
It's less polished than talking about something you've already done, but that's actually fine. The interviewer is seeing how you work through problems in real time.
Let's take a moment to pause here. If conversations like this are useful for you, you can let us know by liking the video. This lets us know that the work we are doing is helpful. Thank you.
So, we've been talking about the content of interview conversations, but I think the tone is just as important as what's actually being said.
The tone in American interviews is usually professional but not stiff. There's a balance between being serious and being personable.
Right. You're not trying to be overly formal or distant, but you're also not being casual in the way you might be with a colleague you've known for years.
Yes, it's somewhere in the middle. You're respectful, you're focused, but you're also human.
And I think that comes across in a lot of small ways. The way people make eye contact during the conversation, or the way they might smile briefly when something lands well.
There's also a directness in American interview conversations that's worth noticing. Questions are usually asked clearly, and answers are expected to be clear as well. People aren't talking around things. If an interviewer wants to know how you handled a specific challenge, they'll ask that directly, and you're expected to address it directly in your response. But direct doesn't mean blunt or harsh. The tone is still considerate. It's just that there's not a lot of ambiguity in how questions are framed or how answers are expected to be given.
And that directness extends to how people talk about themselves in interviews. You're expected to be clear about what you've done and what you're capable of without being vague or overly modest.
At the same time, there's a balance. You're not exaggerating or overstating things, but you're also not downplaying your contributions.
It's interesting because that balance is very culturally specific. In American professional contexts, there's an expectation that you'll advocate for yourself clearly while still being accurate and honest.
And that comes through in how people describe their role in projects or accomplishments. You'll often hear people say, I led this initiative, or I developed this process, rather than we or the team.
Although we definitely comes up too, especially when talking about collaborative work. The key is being clear about your specific contribution within the team effort.
Right. You're not taking credit for everything, but you're also making sure the interviewer understands what you personally did. Another thing about tone in these conversations is how people handle questions they find challenging or unexpected. That's a moment where tone really matters because your response in that moment says a lot about how you handle uncertainty or difficulty.
The typical approach is to stay composed. If you need a moment to think, you might say something like, "That's a good question. Let me think about that for a second."
And that's perfectly acceptable. You're not expected to have an instant answer to everything.
But you are expected to engage with the question thoughtfully rather than deflecting or avoiding it. So even if you don't have a perfect answer, you're working through it out loud in a way that shows your thinking process. And the interviewer is usually patient with that because they understand that some questions are meant to be challenging.
We've touched on this a bit already, but I think it's worth talking more specifically about the cultural expectations that shape these conversations in American workplaces.
Yeah, because understanding those expectations is really what helps you read the room during an interview.
One big one is the expectation of clarity. In American professional communication, there's a preference for being explicit rather than leaving things implied.
So, if you're asked about a weakness or an area where you struggled, the expectation is that you'll name it clearly rather than dancing around it.
But you're also expected to talk about what you learned or how you've addressed it. So it's not just about admitting a problem, it's about showing that you're reflective and capable of growth. That reflectiveness is valued in these conversations. People want to see that you think about your work, not just do it.
Yeah. Another expectation is engagement. In an interview, you're expected to be actively present in the conversation, not just passively answering questions. That might mean asking clarifying questions if something isn't clear, or it might mean picking up on something the interviewer said earlier and referencing it later in the conversation. Those small moments of engagement show that you're listening and that you're interested in the dialogue, not just waiting for your turn to speak.
There's also an expectation around time. American interviews usually have a set duration, and there's an awareness of that throughout the conversation. So if you're answering a question, you're giving enough detail to be thorough, but you're also being mindful not to go on so long that there's no time for other questions.
It's not about rushing, but there is a consciousness about using time well.
And that relates to something else, which is the expectation that you'll be prepared. Not scripted, but prepared.
Right. You've thought about your experience. You've considered what's relevant to this particular role, and you're ready to talk about it in a way that's organized and clear.
The interviewer can usually tell when someone has done that preparation because the conversation flows more naturally. You're not scrambling to remember things or trying to figure out what to say on the spot.
Although I should say, being prepared doesn't mean memorizing answers. It means knowing your own story well enough that you can talk about it conversationally.
Exactly. Because if you sound like you're reciting something you memorized, that actually breaks the conversational feel of the interview.
And I think that gets at something important about these conversations. They're professional and structured, but they're still meant to feel like a genuine exchange between two people.
The interviewer is trying to get to know you as a professional, and that's hard to do if the conversation feels rehearsed or performative.
So there's this balance you're striking throughout the interview. You're being professional, you're being clear, you're being thoughtful, but you're also being yourself.
And that authenticity comes through in small ways. The way you describe your work, the things you choose to mention, the questions you ask.
Speaking of questions, the end of the interview usually includes time for the candidate to ask questions. And that's an interesting part of the conversation.
It is because it's a moment where the dynamic shifts slightly. You're no longer just responding, you're initiating part of the dialogue.
And the questions you ask are part of the conversation. They show what you're curious about, what matters to you professionally, what you've been thinking about while learning about the role.
Good questions in this context are usually pretty specific. They're not generic things like, what's the culture like at this company? They're more like, you mentioned the team is working on expanding into new markets. How is that effort being structured?
That kind of question shows you were listening during the conversation and that you're thinking about the role in a concrete way.
It also gives the interviewer a chance to share more about the work, which can make the conversation feel more collaborative and less one-sided.
And that collaborative feeling is really what distinguishes a good interview conversation from one that feels more like an interrogation.
Right. Both people are contributing. Both people are engaged. It's structured, but it's still a dialogue.
As the interview winds down, there's usually a pretty clear signal that things are coming to a close.
The interviewer might glance at the time or say something like, I think we're coming up on the end of our time here.
And then there's usually a moment where they'll outline next steps. What happens after this conversation when you might hear back, whether there will be additional interviews?
That information is given pretty clearly, and it's expected that you'll listen carefully and ask for clarification if anything is unclear.
Then there's the closing, which is similar in tone to the opening. It's professional but warm.
The interviewer will usually thank you for your time, and you'll do the same. There might be a brief moment of casual conversation as you're wrapping up, but it's much shorter than the opening buffer.
And then the conversation is over. The interview is done.
So, if we step back and think about what we've been talking about, I think the main thing is that interviews in American companies are professional conversations with a specific structure and purpose.
They're not casual, but they're also not meant to feel cold or impersonal. There's a human element to them, even though they're clearly professional interactions.
And understanding that conversational nature of interviews helps you participate in them more effectively because you're not thinking of it as a test you're trying to pass. You're thinking of it as a conversation you're having.
A conversation where you're trying to communicate clearly about who you are professionally and what you can contribute.
And where the other person is trying to understand that by asking questions and listening carefully to how you respond.
The rhythm, the pacing, the tone, the way questions and answers flow back and forth. All of that creates the interview experience.
And if you're listening to how those elements work in American professional contexts, you start to pick up on the patterns that make these conversations feel natural and coherent.
because they are natural in a sense. They're structured, but they're still just people talking about work.
And the more you listen to how people talk in these settings, the more familiar the rhythm becomes.
That's really what this is about: listening, noticing, understanding how the conversation moves.
Not performing, not following a script, just engaging in the dialogue as clearly and authentically as you can.
That's a good place to leave it.
I think so. We'll continue sharing conversations like this regularly. If you'd like to hear more, you're welcome to subscribe.
Thank you for the dialogue.
Thank you. This was time well spent.